Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Power Plays and Paydays here on EBNet Stream. And look who's with us again, my favorite partner on this series. We have Bheki Mahlobo from France Cronier Private Clients. Bheki, welcome back from the land of war and tariffs. How are you?
Leon, it's great to be back, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's good to be back full time in South Africa and be with my family and do the good work here.
I can only imagine. So the studies are now done. Congratulations, you have graduated. You are now what?
Well, I have my master's in economics now from the United States. So that's what I was studying over the past 2 years, which was a grueling master's to study. But, I put my head down, did the hard work, and graduated and got good grades. And now I'm back here and using the skills that I've gotten from the United States and applying them here in South Africa.
Well, Bheki, we're sharing your success and we're exceptionally proud of you. So I can see it in your eyes that you're proud of yourself as well. So congratulations, well done. To do something like that, to travel around the world, to be on your own, to have to interact with new people and put yourself through that kind of stress is not an easy thing to do. So congratulations and well done. Very, very proud of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So we now need to catch our audience up on quite a few months worth of stuff, turmoil, and things that have been happening both here locally in South Africa, but then globally as well. So I'm not going to tell you where to start. You know very well where to kick off from. Catch us up.
Yeah, so the most topical of themes to start off here is what's been going on in the Middle East, that being that of the Iran war. And for the audience to have a proper understanding and the picture to be set and painted as to what this conflict has resulted in, is that much of the analysis, if we can take ourselves back about 2, 3 months ago, when this war essentially started, was that it was going to trigger a slashing of global economic growth rates and trigger a downturn in stock markets in the United States as well as that of emerging markets. Our thinking at the time is that by day 10, much of the war had actually ended. And the reason why we said that is that if you were to look at the total missile launches from Iran's retaliatory strikes, that being that of drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, those had declined by over 90% by day 10 of the war. And the subsequent days after day 10 was essentially an economic and diplomatic impasse between the United States and Iran, in which pressure would be the determining factor of what actually happens between the two nations. At that point, we drew 6 scenarios that you can have access to as a common sense subscriber, of which our leanings was on particularly scenario 2, which was a US strategic withdrawal, or as well as that of scenario 4, which was a de-escalation by Iran. Essentially, those 2 scenarios paved the way for a nearer resolution to the conflict rather than that dragging on to over a year. And because of that, we were able to think and advance our thinking as to what are the implications of this in terms of Brent crude prices, as well as the global economic outlook. And to answer that, we looked at inflation-adjusted prices of Brent crude oil over the past 30 years. And what you can see if you draw that chart there is that at the peak of the Iran conflict, Brent crude prices, the inflation-adjusted price was sitting at about $100. That's below the levels that you saw at the peak of the Russian-Ukraine war. It's below the levels that you saw during the Arab Spring of December 2010 going into 2011, and below the levels of Brent crude inflation-adjusted prices before the 2008 global financial crisis. And if you were to look at that trend, it led our thinking to say that much of the economic performance of the global economy would not tanker due to the war, which was at counter with much of the mainstream analysis that at the time. And if we and drawing on that, we said that much of the decline that you saw in stock markets would actually recover and actually trade higher, and which is the analysis which is proven to be correct. If we have to look at, for example, global GDP, it hasn't moved much if you look at the numbers produced by the World Bank, OECD, as well as the IMF. Those haven't been slashed significantly. And Brent crude prices now about below, have declined by over 30% since the peak of the war, and stock markets are generally up compared to where they were in February. In fact, even higher than that at that point level. However, there was a risk that was beginning to emerge, and that was if you were to look at the oil inventories, which you can look at it as shock absorbers. This is the oil that's stored in facilities as well as that of oil tankers at sea. That was acting as a shock absorber due to the conflict that was happening in the Middle East. And what we saw, particularly what oil executives that of Chevron were highlighting, is that one of the most prominent oil facilities in the United States, which is responsible for about 15% of private oil storage, its capacity, if you look at it, a 10-year trend, had averaged over 50%. Its utilization rates was sitting at about 50%, of which it declined to about 25% during the conflict, which flagged a lot of risks for oil executives that we're seeing a shrinking of storage capacity of oil, which would lead to supply squeeze and therefore trigger a spike in oil prices. Well, as this deal has been announced, the memorandum of understanding, what we're seeing, the result of this deal is for the passage through the Strait of Hormuz to recover towards the third quarter, meaning that that stress and that risk of an oil squeeze, particularly from the supply side, has largely reduced, and that we're going to continue to see oil prices continue to decline. In fact, our number that we produced in March, in early March, was that we were going to see Brent crude prices trade between the band of about $65 to $73, which is, if you will look at the current trend, is looking to be that trend currently. What does that particularly mean for South Africa? Well, the petrol price right now sits about 27 and 95 cents, so about 28 rands. The petrol price is above 30 rands for 1 liter. And what we see with the decline in oil prices, as well as our forecast, is that for South Africa's petrol prices to come back down into the low 20s towards the end of the year.
So that's relief on the petrol price, but inflation has now started to pick up, and we've missed probably one or two rate cuts as a result of that. So the effect on the on the average man in the street is that it has impacted us in those ways. So hopefully the petrol price comes back. Inflation, do you think it will come back as well, or people maintain prices at a high level?
Yeah, the most important thing to look at with South Africa's inflation is that it's largely driven from supply side. And a lot of those inputs, particularly that of fuel, has been the main driver of South Africa's consumer price increase over the past 2 months, where the latest number that you're referring to there, Leon, has risen to about 4.5% from 4%, which the important thing to realize with that is that it's important for the direction of South African interest rates. The rate that actually hits households in terms of their car financing, mortgages, as well as that of businesses to actually borrow a loan for capital and for expansion. Now, because consumer prices has risen above the South African Reserve's inflation target of 3%, that has led them to actually hike interest rates in June by 25 basis points. But if we were to look at these latest numbers in May, they come slightly below what was expected, which was about 4.7%. We expected inflation to be about 4.8%, but it's still above the SARB's inflation target of 3%. And our view actually is that we are near the peak of the upward trajectory that we're seeing in consumer prices as a result of the massive decline in oil prices, which is going to reduce a lot of the input costs that businesses and households are currently facing. So come July, and should July's inflation print, be below that of the May print, which is about 4.5%, be below that, we think that the case for the SARB will be for them to hold, but they will continue to hold and signal hawkish toe, in other words, keeping interest rates higher, in order for inflation to come back comfortably to their target of 3%. And then from that point, they'll reassess and look towards cutting interest rates.
Just quickly, you've spent time in the States during this call it almost confusing process, because the press has been quite difficult to understand whether the war's on or off, and who's winning, and whether the negotiations are going well or not, and so on. So it's been quite confusing to watch from afar. What was the local sentiment around this war? Was it accepted by the population, or was there quite a lot of what's the right word, kickback in terms of it?
Yeah, so at the start of the war, what we saw, particularly if you look at polling numbers, this is the way to actually have a sense of what is the support for people in support of people of the Iran war. And what we saw is that there was actually a majority of Republicans supported United States intervention in the war in the Middle East. However, Democrats, 90% of them opposed. So there's this massive split between Republicans and Democrats. So within his base, President Donald Trump had a lot of support to actually carry forth with his military operation in Iran. However, what Republicans were against, particularly with that of the Democrats as well, which was the consensus, was a ground invasion in Iran, which prevented that option from actually even happening. That wasn't considered by the Americans' perspective, given that they understood what the public opinion polls were saying. The risk that President Trump faced, if you can, what we said initially, what I said in terms of the diplomatic impasse, the pressure points that we're seeing, particularly with this war, was a continuation of the conflict for months ahead, as well as going that to over a year, which would weaken the support that he had in terms of this intervention in Iran and turn negative. An indicator that we're actually seeing for this is that of the Michigan consumer sentiment, which during the Iran conflict declined to the lowest point since inception, which is about 1970 of the index. And when we looked at it, for every president that had a consumer sentiment index below 70 points, suggesting pessimistic by household expenditure, United States would result in them losing midterm elections, which happens every 2 years in the United States, which this year is coming forth in the 4th of November. So definitely there was risk in terms of the US president facing. He initially had support from the Republicans of his interventions. However, as the war dragged on, that support watered down and materialized in terms of consumer sentiment. The prices of gasoline, for example, which massively increased, and the inflation levels that as a result of it in the United States, particularly for poor households, was straining a lot of his support when we look at polling numbers as well as consumer sentiment.
So when you look at the memorandum, or the terms that were reached, do you think that they got what they wanted? Do you think that Trump won from that perspective? It seems like it if I look at it.
Yes. Yeah, it does seem definitely that the Americans played their cards right in terms of the memorandum of understanding. And the most significant point that needs to be noticed here is that they've changed the balance of power of crude from the Middle East to that of the Americas. America is now the world's leading crude exporter in the world. And they now have supply chains that can actually supply oil to Europe as well as other nations, which used to be the case for what would happen in the Middle East. And people would also appreciate the kind of power that the Middle East had. If you look at the Suez crisis that happened in 1949, where Egypt essentially nationalized the Suez Canal. And the resulting consequence was a rampant increase in oil prices. Now that's under the hands of Americans, and they want to continue to export oil, which would means the oil price continues to decline. And increasing the expansion in terms of fractional, in terms of drilling in America, as well as that of exporting other crude products and petroleum products. So in that regard, they've won. Another part that they've won is that the objective of this war was to massively set back Iran's nuclear ambitions, which is what they have achieved, as this understanding also says that Iran would therefore destroy its uranium-enriched facilities in terms of its stockpile, rather. And that's what the Americans has achieved. And what Iran would get was essentially an unfreezing of their sovereign assets, which is equating to roughly about 25 billion. And there's also conversation of a development fund between America and Iran, which is estimated about 300 billion, which is the rebuilding of infrastructure that was destroyed as a result of the conflict. In terms of America, they've indeed won in terms of this war, as mentioned, with those objectives that they've achieved, as well as Iran now, is that they face less pressure and they actually get a development deal out of this deal.
EBNet is proud to bring you top quality content from experts across the financial services industry in South Africa and internationally, for free. Your support helps us in doing this. All we ask is that you subscribe to our channels by clicking the subscribe button below. Share this video with others you think will benefit from it, and give us thumbs up if you are enjoying the content. That way, you help us help you. Thank you from the team at EBNet. For more great content, please visit www.ebnet.co.za.
So isn't it? I just have to laugh inside there because of the saying, "Man, the money makes the world go round." I mean, these two arch enemies have now reached a deal, and if you look at it, ultimately, it's a lot about power and money. That's the reality of it. So Trump has won. Okay, at the end of the day, he's won. That's going to bode well for him leading into the midterm elections. We have our own municipal elections coming up. Is not
Yes.
it on the same day? What day is it in
Yes, it is
November?
actually on the same day, on the 4th of November. That's the same day as the American midterms as well as South Africa's local elections.
So interesting political times, and we went into budget speech this year with quite a bit of optimism. It was a decent budget, albeit that it seemed like we were celebrating too low growth, if I could put it that way. So it was almost like, well, we'll hobble along and that's okay. But there was a positive sentiment. Then the war hit,
Hmm.
and things turned around a little bit. We've also had the shenanigans within the DEA with John Steenhuisen going, and now Gordon Lewis coming in. We've got Helen swimming in potholes around Johannesburg, making quite a bit of interesting noise, entertaining noise for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, and we've been watching the Madlanga Commission, which I found fascinating, and it's good to see that there has been action, albeit that I'm not certain that the action's at the right levels again,
Hmm.
off the back of it. But there's definitely been action taking place, and now we're sitting with the possible impeachment of Cyril Ramaphosa.
Yes.
So, can you? It's impossible to talk about the economics without the politics in South Africa.
Yes.
That's the
Yes.
reality. So how are you
Yes.
seeing that economic picture and the GNU versus the ANC Cyril power play that's going on, all panning out?
I think you put it actually eloquently in terms of it's impossible to look at South Africa's economics without looking at its politics. And our thinking and our thesis on this is the cause and effect in South Africa. If you don't see the right policies that would lift confidence, it means that South Africa's investment levels will continue to stagnate, and we thereby be an economy that grows at near 1%. And what we're seeing currently with the GNU, in terms of what we're seeing, we're not seeing substantive move towards reform that would lift confidence levels and thereby fixed investment level and take South Africa where it can easily be at and where it should be. What we're seeing, particularly with this impeachment process, is that the idea of Cyril Ramaphosa being a reformer, being a man who's wearing a white suit, who's clean and untouched, has largely dissipated and has watered down. Let's recall what happened in 2018, where there was much optimism for the current president. In fact, at that time, this was when I was starting my career as an analyst, and I was working at a research institution called the Center for Risk Analysis, and much of our analysis at that time was that Cyril Ramaphosa was not a reformer. We saw the tail signs at that point, given the policies that he was perpetuating, given the policies that were drafted under him. And we faced quite a lot of backlash, particularly from corporate clients, as there was a lot of optimism behind him. However, now with this impeachment process, a lot of that branding has watered away, and the ANC is indeed in trouble, as it will continue to lose its support levels up until there's a president that takes up the helm and takes support levels back to where it should be. And we think this is actually Patrice Motsepe, is a very serious man, a shrewd businessman that would lift confidence levels and fixed investment levels and take South Africa back to where it should be. And understanding that we stress for clients here, that's particularly, I think it's quite relevant for what we're speaking of here, is that if we're looking at voters' opinion, and particularly on the question of regime change, with the ANC losing a national election in 2024, is that for there to be successful regime change, there's two steps that usually need to be achieved. The first one is that the people need to feel that their interests will not be protected. And the second step is that for another party, for those interests to be protected by that other party. What we're currently seeing is that that's not materializing, particularly for the DA as of currently, as if we were to look at our polling numbers, the ANC sits at about 40%, accounting for a margin of error. The DA polls at about 25%, which is about the same levels that it once did the same level essentially in 2024. And if we were to look at Helen Zille's campaign in Johannesburg, her support levels, although it should be noticed, are quite remarkable. It sits at about 40%. But for her to have a serious coalition partner, she needs about 45% and above. And in order to do so, they need to convince South Africans that they would be able to protect their interests. Their handlement right now in terms of the Department of Agriculture and the foot and mouth disease has absolutely betrayed the trust of farmers and has weakened the DA as being seen as a party that can actually be held accountable. In fact, in terms of the voters' minds currently, is that they're very much the same. And the DA should be aware of this, is that the ANC is seeing its trouble and its strategic plans to actually equate itself with that of the DA, and for the voters who see no difference between the two parties. And the true competitor to the DA is not that of the ANC. Its true opposition is not the ANC. The DA's true opposition is actually what we're seeing as enclaves, which we're seeing as an emerging trend in South Africa, where society in South Africa is fragmenting from the politics. As the state recedes, a lot of the private sector individuals, and particularly households and private individuals, plug in those gaps. We see this with the movement of goods in the country that are moving on roads instead of railways. We're seeing this as well with electricity generation in the country, where should we see massive breakdown levels and load shedding, we're seeing solar panels in shopping centers as well as private households. And we're seeing this as well with the movement of money, where a lot of South Africans can plug their money into dollars but still be in South Africa. Should we continue to see no substantive move in reforms in the country, even from that of the DA, that trend continues to grow at as much as the state recedes. And that's our thinking. As the state recedes and weakens, the balkanization of South Africa, the enclaves, continue to become prosperous and successful. And in order for business to operate currently and be successful in South Africa, is an understanding of that trend.
Do you not think that the DA, in forming the GNU, took the wrong path, in the sense that they try to be a bit more cooperative to keep it all together, and have become almost a little bit, it's not silent, but less noisy, to use that term. And that's perhaps hurt them a little bit, because now they're just in the same bucket and not seeing the reforms coming through. Nothing's changing on the streets. The water's still out, however often. So now you paint everyone with the same brush, where perhaps they should have been a bit more, I suppose, aggressive and more opposition party-like kind of thing, in order to stand out a little bit in that regard. Or was that simply going to be too disruptive for the GNU?
I actually think the DA forming a coalition with the ANC and the result of that being the GNU was actually a positive move for them, as the alternative was that of the ANC to partner up with the MK and the EFF, and the economic consequences from that, due to the policy and the likely money printing that would have occurred, would have been the worst scenario for South Africa. So I think the DA actually holding the line and preventing that actually allows a scenario where South Africa could see those reforms continue and be implemented. And actually, we've seen some of the positive sentiment of this.
But
if you
that's better for South Africa. But what about better in terms of the longer term
Yes.
power play and
Yes.
their ambition to be in power?
Yes, no, and that's a very significant point. In terms of the ordinary man on the streets, like, where do they get to see those benefits? Unfortunately, right now, we're not seeing substantive moves to actually benefit that person. As really, if we're looking at it, the macro trend lines that South Africa needs to be on the path with, we don't see any kind of caliber and professionalism within the DA to take macro South Africa to where it needs to be. As the policies that we're seeing being that of education, being that of the Department of Agriculture, education, essentially what we're seeing there is a move by the DA not to allow the parents to actually have decision power over the schools and actually removing certain criteria of kids being accepted into formal Model C schools, which we're seeing as a disastrous policy that will negatively impact middle-class working Black South Africans in the country, as well as other families in the country. So in terms of policy, we're not seeing the proper thinking within the DA, but it was the right decision for them to form a coalition with the ANC, as it does allow the space for reforms to materialize. However, should we continue to be the current trend line, the risk that is for the DA is the continuation of the enclaves, and for what befell the ANC in 2024 to also be that of the DA, where their support levels, as they continue to be equated with the ANC, as they continue to be equated as a party that actually doesn't govern to the extent where they can be accountable and implement the necessary reforms, their support levels decline and the enclaves continue to flourish.
So I mentioned the Madlanga Commission, and what I found, I'm almost want to say I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised in the level of the culture has become one of corruption. And you're surprised, yet you get stopped on the side of the road and you're paying for lunch, kind of thing, and that's become the norm. So I don't know why we're surprised in that respect, but just to hear the levels to which it's gone, the seniority is quite alarming. So now you look at the ANC power race and you look at the bench, essentially,
Yes.
of who's to come.
Yes.
You mentioned Patrice Motsepe. You're saying
Yes.
okay. So I want to come back to that.
Yes.
But you've got Paul Mashatile. You've got a whole lot of accusations against him. So there's a what's going on here, but concerning. But coming back to Patrice, and I want to draw the parallel to Cyril Ramaphosa. Okay. So when Cyril first came into the deputy president sort of role, right, everyone was delighted because he was a businessman. Right, he understood the economics, and I remember at the time thinking to myself, because I'd met him a couple of times before, sat on the same board for a business that I was part of, and I mean, he didn't really add much from a business perspective. I mean, I always saw him as
Yes.
being a socialist that came from a union sort of
Yes.
background. He wasn't often well prepared. He didn't even really know where he was. He was more, almost, I use the term, the fatties and monies granny that's pulled out of the cupboard and
Yeah.
steered around whenever needed, kind of thing. So I think that was a false perception that we all had around who Cyril Ramaphosa was and what he was capable of. So why is Patrice different?
That's a good question. And actually, how we know that Patrice Motsepe is the opposite of Cyril Ramaphosa is that we speak to the right people. In 2018, we spoke to the right people and we looked at the legislation that was coming from him, and we saw that he is not a reformer. With the people that we speak with are surrounding that of Patrice Motsepe, or the people that are familiar with how he leads. But we don't, not only that, but let's say you want to have a gauge of what kind of a caliber is the man, is that look at his soccer club, which is a serious soccer club in South Africa. And he's deputy presidency of the CAF as well. He's a serious man and he should be taken seriously. And he's the type of man that if you were to be the chairman of a board, which essentially is that of the ANC president, he's the chairperson of the executive branch of the ANC. And the reason why we haven't seen substantive reforms is that chairperson has been lackluster, hasn't had the actual zest and inclination to have hard decisions to take South Africa to where it should be. Whereas Patrice Motsepe is the exact opposite. That's all that needs to be done. There's no actually significant degree that South Africa has to shift and completely rip what we cannot not already achieve. We already did it in the early 2000s under President Bheki. What all just needs to happen is to take the necessary decisions. If the chairman of the board of the ANC says, for example, there will be no expropriation or compensation, no healthcare insurance, we're going to give confidence to businesses to invest in the country, and we're going to talk to the Americans, the executive branch of the ANC will follow their chairperson. The reason why we're not seeing that is due to the weakness of Cyril Ramaphosa, where he leads by consensus and the decisions does not come from him. That is not Patrice Motsepe. And actually looking at the polling numbers, the most popular politician right now is not a politician at all, actually, Leon. As if you were to look at his favorability, if we ask the question to South Africans, who would you be in support of becoming the president of the ANC? Patrice Motsepe's support level sit at about 40% as a proportion of registered eligible voters, registered voters. Compare that to to the people that he will be running against, such as Fikile Mbalula as well as Paul Mashatile. They are about half of where he currently is. And amongst ANC supporters, his support levels sit at about 47%. So there's a lot of support for him, and actually intensified as the idea of Patrice Motsepe becoming a serious contender has actually lifted his support levels amongst South Africans. Now, the question is, will he become the president of the ANC? And that actually is quite a little bit of a complicated question to answer, as the ANC, how it governs, is that it allows a lot of the fractional issues to take hold of issues within the party. Although they're seeing Patrice Motsepe being popular, what actually governs much of the ANC is a lot of the fractional issues, which may therefore not lead to him becoming president of the ANC. So it's still a question mark whether he can be as well.
Or does it compromise him in becoming that leader by having to effectively, what's the right word, garner those votes that he'll need to get there?
Yes.
It's a challenge, because at the end of the day, he has to deploy people that have competence, and he can't afford to be paying favors.
Exactly. And as a consequence, should we not see that, we either continue with the base case scenario where we currently are, or we see a populist coalition. In fact, we are developing 3 pathways where South Africa may head that we're going to brief clients, where we see economic prospects of the country over the next 10 years, the cause and the effect, and mapping those onto macro South Africa and where we see things over the next 10 years.
I'm surprised that we haven't yet seen visibly some new opposition coming to the table with making a lot of noise. I was expecting to see it happen, but I haven't really seen much of that over the last while. So I don't know if you know of any new parties that are considering to get into the race.
I'm not aware of any new parties that are considering to enter the race, largely because in order to gain a lot of voters, you need money and you need ideas. On the money side, I'm not particularly seeing massive amounts of donations to small parties. And in terms of the ideas side, I'm not seeing any party that actually can come up with ideas that will oppose much of the analysis that we're currently seeing with that of the ANC and the DA. So to answer your question, no, I don't see any particular other opposition party manifesting.
Well, I was surprised to hear you say that the polling is still sitting with the ANC around 40 and the DA at 25. I mean, I was almost expecting a degradation of that by now, if I could put it that way, over the last 6 months. But that hasn't happened. But then also you hear noise of certain metros being lost in very, call it ANC strongholds.
Yes.
And so there's a bit of conflicting information in that regard.
Yeah, so our view actually of what is likely to happen with the local election is that for about nearly 200 municipalities, there won't be a single majority that leads in that particular municipality. So it'll be amalgamation of parties that don't have majority and would need to form coalition deals amongst each other. And one deal in that environment will also have an impact on other and the sequential deals that happen and henceforth, whether it's an ANC, EFF, MK deal, or whether it's an ANC, DA type of deal. We're already seeing this actually, if we're looking at the current political environment, where at a national level, there's a formal deal between the ANC and DA, but in Gauteng, it's the ANC and the EFF, and possibly that of the MK as well. So what we're seeing that might happen in the local and the municipality are those types of deal negotiations. But again, if we don't see the substantive moves towards South Africa being back to where it should be, what actually happens in the municipal level will matter less and less to the actual middle class South Africans that can afford to plug themselves out of the politics of South Africa. You know, the common question here in Johannesburg is not who's the mayor of Johannesburg, because it's just doesn't matter that much to them, as they have private electricity generation. Some of them have water tanks, Jojo tanks that are about 5,000 liters, and they can afford to fragment from South Africa's political decline, and particularly that of being that at a municipal level or that at a national level. So should we see that in local elections does not mean South Africa therefore goes to being an economy that struggles at 1% to now an economy that will be triggered by massive levels, which we already do see decline in basic service delivery, but a continuation of that decline to the point where we recede as an economy and we see deep recessions, be that also at a macro level. It just means that the enclaves continue to expand and South Africa continues to innovate in terms of plugging in those gaps left by locals and municipality as well as that of a national level.
But our taxes aren't coming down at the same time. So, anyway.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you this question more out of fascination. What are the rules in the likes of the US or other developed countries around people playing a role or being members of parliament, so to speak, or part of the Senate or the whatever, where they have criminal records? I would always have thought, because I've never really thought about it before, that if you've got a criminal record, you would always exclude yourself from being able to play a role within government. That's clearly not the case in South Africa.
Yeah.
What is the case around the rest of the world? Does South Africa not have any rule in that respect at all?
Well, what I saw in the United States is that should you be implicit in allegations of corruption, it is seen as your responsibility to remove yourself from that seat of power. Now, they always need to be determined by a court whether you're indeed guilty. So some public officials in the United States will say, let the courts determine whether I'm guilty or not. However, what's interesting, particularly with the United States, is that they don't like particularly the representative, being that at a district level as well as a state level, to be implicit in allegations of corruption. And the difference between America as well as South Africa is that America has federalism. So within a particular city that you live in, you can vote for your council member and you can vote for your mayor. If you don't like them, you can simply vote them out. In South Africa, it's different. We vote for the party. And the party is the one that determines the ministers. So that's where the incentives are different between the two countries. And that's what I've seen as well. And I think that's what has limited. It still does happen in America where some congressmen and women are implicit either in inside trading or that of allegations of corruption. However, it happens to a lesser extent than what we see in South Africa, and that's due to the way in which these two countries are governed.
So with Julius Malema now having been found guilty of the firing of the gun crime, yes, he's going to appeal and probably carry on forever appealing, but there's nothing stopping him from continuing to serve in Parliament. Because the EFF deploys him as such, and that's it. Even if he was sitting in an orange overall, would he still be able to be a member of Parliament?
I think the rules in South Africa is that if you are found guilty, you're not allowed to be a member of parliament. If you have a criminal record, you can't be a member of parliament, which is the case of Jacob Zuma currently with the MK party. And I think that will be the case with that of the EFF. The important thing to note with the EFF is what does this do to the support levels of the EFF? Those have largely been stagnant since the inception of the party at about 10%. And should he then also not be able to campaign and South Africa not to be where we currently are, which are common sense people, 80% of the time we agree what are the most pressing issues facing the country, and turn to a more radical populace, which is quite easy given South Africa's unemployment rate, which is amongst the highest in the world, and youth unemployment rates. Should we not see that risk materialize from a populist perspective, the support levels of the EFF stay stagnant at 10%, even decline further, given what's currently happening with Julius. However, should we see that a radicalization of South Africa, which hasn't occurred, you may see actually a lift in EFF support, but we're not currently seeing that as of now.
So then, just for my interest, and if you don't know the answer, it's okay. But at what point in time does he have a criminal record? Because the reality is he has been found guilty.
Yeah, I'm not particularly sure of when exactly is it determined that he can't be member of parliament. So those specific details, I don't have them.
It's interesting to see, because otherwise you think to yourself, just appeal and delay. Seems a bit backwards to me.
It just seems that he's just trying to drag it through. Sorry, go ahead.
I say, I mean, if it was a case of that it was immediate, then it would be in his interest to appeal and to get that all done quickly, rather
Yeah.
than to drag it out. Where right now it's a case
Yes.
of, oh, just wait. Seems a bit backwards to me. Anyway, I don't run the government. I don't set the laws. Bheki, thank you so much for joining us, and again, welcome back. It's the country is a better place with you in it. So we're really happy to have you back on Power Plays and Paydays, and we look forward to some more chats with you.
Thank you so much. I look forward to more conversations. And yeah, if for your viewers, if they want to see a lot more of my analysis, they can visit the Common Sense and subscribe to the website where you have in-depth analysis of what we discuss and many other things. We draw forecasts of what happens in South Africa, as well as our depth analysis that you can see in our YouTube channel.
Yeah, so I definitely do recommend that they go to the Common Sense, and I will put a link in the description to this video for them to find it. Bheki, thank you. Have a lovely weekend, and we'll chat again.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you so much. And
Cheers,
thank you
then.
to
Bye.
viewers.